Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maya. I'm an independent college counselor, and in today's video I wanted to talk about the personal statement. So obviously the personal statement is a really big part of the college application process. It's something that people talk about a lot. Everyone kind of knows they have to write this longer essay that goes to most of the colleges that you apply to. So in this video I'll be going over my 8 tips for improving your personal statement. How to fix a personal statement that's not quite working when you feel pretty confident in the topic overall, but it's just like the pieces aren't really falling into place and flowing the way that you would really like. These are all things that I use, when I'm looking at a personal statement for a student and I'm giving them suggestions. So they're definitely things that I have in practice found that can really help essays. I also want to note that this is definitely not something where you should do each of these things to your essay. This is more like, oh, would this help the essay? Would this help the essay? And probably 1 or 2 of them would help your essay. Let's get into it. My first tip, number 1, is use vivid descriptive details in your anecdotes. Actually, let me revise that a little bit. I am assuming that you have anecdotes in your essay. If you don't, you probably should. In fact, you almost definitely should. So let's say that is use anecdotes with descriptive vivid detail. What is an anecdote? An anecdote is basically like a little mini story that helps bring the essay to life for the reader. When people say for writing that you should show, not tell, one of the best ways to do that is with an anecdote. So let me just give you an example. Say you want to show the reader that you are a caring person. So instead of just saying I'm a caring person, you would take a couple sentences to tell a story about a time when you saw an elderly person stumble on the sidewalk and you ran to help them. That's the difference between telling someone about you and showing them what you're like using an anecdote. And then to bring that story to life, you want to use vivid descriptive details. So instead of just saying one time I saw an old man trip on the sidewalk and I went to help him, you would kind of tell a little story, and you would say something like, I was walking home from school on a crisp fall afternoon and the sun was shining, but there was a chill in the air. I looked across the street and saw an old man who I had never seen before stumble and fall on the sidewalk. I quickly checked for cars and then rushed to his side. This is not an example of amazing prose. I would have you revise that. But that's an example of an anecdote with descriptive detail. And you want to be including things like that in your personal statement. An anecdote doesn't have to be a specific length. It can really just be like a sentence, or it could be a whole paragraph, just depending on how important it is to the overall message in the personal statement. You can add an anecdote almost anywhere in an essay. You just need to find a place where you're talking about something generally and then get as specific as you can about it. So if there's a point in the essay where you say something like, I love history, instead of just making that general statement, you could talk about the time when you sat down with a history book that was especially exciting, you were turning the page to see what was going to happen next. When you're writing an anecdote, as much as possible, you want to engage some of the senses. So things you saw, heard, tasted, touched, smelled. I've noticed in recent years, a lot of people have written about food in personal statements. That kind of became a trend for a while. And the nice thing about writing about food is that, it offers sensory details really obviously, because people talk about how this traditional food that their family made, how it smelled or tasted. And that immediately kind of makes the personal statement more vibrant to read. It comes to life as you're reading it, as you're kind of picturing or sort of imagining smelling or tasting this food. Sometimes I feel like the food thing is a little overdone, but it's just a good example though of how to engage the senses in an anecdote in a personal statement. And definitely feel free to write about food if you want to. Okay, so moving on to tip number 2. If the essay is almost all just about one single event, so I would kind of call this the one big anecdote essay, consider expanding the focus. I see this come up in different ways, but I often see it come up in early drafts for students that are responding to the challenge question. So they're trying to show a time where they overcame a challenge, and they end up just focusing in on one very specific time and one very specific challenge. So this might be something like an essay about how when you were 14, you managed to overcome your fear of heights to cross this scary rope bridge at this summer camp. So, you have this whole draft about how this was this fear that was looming in your mind, and, you tried to do it once and you couldn't, and then you kind of had to give yourself a pep talk or maybe talk to somebody, and you finally kind of pulled yourself together, and then you did it, and now you know that you can overcome a challenge and push yourself through something that's hard. And, I'm not belittling these stories. This could be a great story. It could be really engaging, and it does technically answer the question. The issue is it a good personal statement? I would say this is something where you could use it, but the scope is a little small and it could probably be better. I also tend to suggest to students that they don't only focus on something that happened in their childhood or early on in high school, because you want the college to know who you are today. So a personal statement like this, or a sort of anecdote like this, how you overcame your fear of heights when you were 14, could actually be much stronger as a starting point for a broader story. Maybe instead of making that whole essay about overcoming that fear of heights when you were 14, you instead use that as a small anecdote at the beginning as a kind of jumping off point for some even bigger fear that you had to overcome later on, more recently. And there was something about that memory that enabled you to then pull yourself together and get through this new experience. This is all just about taking a very limited event and making it part of a bigger story that tells the college readers more about who you are rather than just letting them know who you were in that one moment at that one time. So let's go on to tip number 3. If you're summarizing a lot, basically the opposite of the essay I was just talking about, this would be the no anecdotes essay, focus in on key moments or events. So I kind of covered this earlier when I was talking about anecdotes, like how to actually add this in. But the key here is that you don't want the personal statement to become kind of like a resume of accomplishments or just this really quick overview of like lots of things that you've done, because that makes it feel not as personal. It becomes more just like a list of facts. So let's say you're writing a personal statement that is focusing on your passion for computer science and engineering. So this started with you loving Legos as a kid, and then you taught yourself various programming languages, and then you went to a few different engineering summer camps, and then you joined robotics where you won awards, and you just really love it. And look, here's all this evidence. There's all these things you've done that show how much passion you have for this. In 650 words, if you're talking about this many things, you just don't have space necessarily to go in depth, and so it can end up seeming a little superficial. Even if it doesn't read like a resume, like even if you're kind of talking in sort of a personable way that's, more familiar, it can still lack the depth that you want to make it really memorable, to bring the essay to life, to make you a really memorable person to the admissions reader. Rather than trying to include everything, you should focus in on some key moments or events that will help the reader really understand like why this matters to you so much. Like, what were the formative moments in your experience in this field, or kind of in whatever you're writing about? Like, which moments were really important? You shouldn't feel like you need to cover everything like in a resume, because that will be in your activities. If you don't have enough space in the activities to talk about everything you've done, you can add it to the additional information section. You need to focus on writing a compelling story, and not like you need to include every single thing you've ever done in a personal statement. Again, that's basically going back to number 1. We need some vivid anecdotes that really help us understand your motivations and your love for this, or if it's on a different kind of topic, that just help us sort of see this through your eyes in more depth in the moment. Okay, so far I've been talking a lot about anecdotes, adding anecdotes, making anecdotes smaller, making anecdotes bigger, making them work together. Let's move on and talk about structure. My tip number 4 is overhaul the introduction. I find that the first introduction you draft for almost any piece of writing tends to be kind of like a warm-up. A lot of times they end up being too long, and this is something that I actually did a lot, like especially when I was in college and grad school and I was writing papers, and I would sit down to write an essay and I would just be really nervous about whether I was going to have enough to say to make it long enough. So I'd kind of like expand as much as possible on whatever I was saying at the beginning. And then you end up with this introduction that's really long and may or may not end up matching what you say in the rest of the essay. I actually have a really big issue with students with this when they write this really long introduction, and then as they're telling the rest of the story of the personal statement, they hit the word count really fast because they've already used so much of it, and then they just stop writing. And I very strongly advise, like especially on your first draft of the personal statement, absolutely ignore the word count. I usually suggest writing up till even like 800 words, like basically sitting down and writing out everything that you have to say about the topic, because otherwise you'll cut yourself off before you've said something really important that you have to say. But to go back to the introduction, so often the introduction that you sat down to write at the beginning, a lot of times it'll be too long. It may or may not be a good fit for the rest of the essay. Or it might be that in the process of writing the rest of the essay, you really honed in on an idea that when you started writing, you didn't quite realize that the essay was going to be about. On another small tangent, this happens a ton with academic essays. I would see this a lot when I taught writing at UCI. Basically, by the time the student got to the end of the essay, in the conclusion, they would really have what should be their thesis statement, like they finally figured out what they were trying to argue, and they really needed to go back, look at that conclusion, pick out the thesis, and then put it back in the introduction. Not about the personal statement, but honestly, the principle is kind of the same. Even if you started the essay really well with a fun anecdote, it could be that by the time you've reached the end, that anecdote isn't the best introduction for the essay. So basically, I just suggest always going back to the intro. Don't ever feel like, oh, because I started with that, like that's the intro I'm stuck with now. You have to always stay flexible about what the best introduction to your personal statement might be. The intro is just really important for getting the reader's attention and sort of setting the stage for the rest of the essay, and you don't want to get stuck on what you had in the first draft. My tip number 5 is experiment with chronology. So this can actually help a lot with number 4, overhaul the introduction, because very often I find that what ends up being a great introduction is something that you wrote about a little bit later in the essay. Often when people sit down to start writing an essay, they'll write about whatever they're talking about in approximately chronological order. If you're telling the story of how you got interested in a certain thing or just how you experienced something throughout your life, usually the default is to kind of start with when you were younger, and progress up till now. But remember that you don't have to tell the story in order. One kind of like essay hack that I find works surprisingly often to improve personal statements is to actually take an anecdote from usually the middle of the essay or maybe the end of the essay and just pop that right into the beginning as the hook. Basically, by doing this, you're setting up suspense. So you're kind of dropping in a tense moment, ideally, from later on, where the reader is going to be kind of not sure of the outcome. And then you backtrack to the beginning of the story, and then they're kind of compelled to keep reading because they want to know what's going to happen at the end of that anecdote that you put at the beginning. This definitely doesn't work for every essay. Remember, at the beginning I said each of these tips is going to be relevant to different people. It's just like one really useful way to set up some suspense if your essay needs that, and can also really help for, putting a nice anecdote and some sensory details right in the beginning of the essay to catch the reader's attention. Tip number 6, include a storytelling arc with what I call an aha moment. You may or may not be familiar with what a storytelling arc looks like, but hopefully you are at least a little bit from English class. Basically, it's, you have exposition, you have rising action, there's a climax, and then there's falling action. And that's kind of the central idea of like what a dramatic plot looks like. Many good essays follow an arc kind of like this. So there'll be kind of an introduction, there'll be sort of building action or sort of suspense as we kind of like wonder how you're going to deal with an issue or how you're going to progress with something in your life. And then towards the end of the essay, but not the very end, you have a moment where you have like an insight into yourself or into understanding something that's really important to you. And then the rest of the essay kind of ties that up and often ties it back to the beginning. Now, I know I just said that experiment with chronology was my last tip. A storytelling arc doesn't necessarily mean that has to be happening chronologically. It just means that you're building up to a climax, or what I call the aha moment, or this sort of moment of insight. So this can be something helpful to think about if you feel like your personal statement's a little bit flat, or you're just kind of talking about thing after thing that happened. You can consider whether you are building suspense and whether you're kind of like leading up to something that is, the aha, the kind of insight, usually into something about yourself. Usually it's kind of like a self-realization about who you are or what matters to you that will really make the essay memorable. Tip number 7, for that aha moment, try focusing in on something small and personal rather than like the big moment. So the big obvious moment is usually like some sort of major accomplishment. I see this a lot in, say, like an early draft of a sports essay. It'll be like the moment when you won the big game. I feel like this could also just be called the I won moment, like I won the debate competition, I won the sports tournament, all of that hard work and persistence finally paid off. And I completely understand why this ends up being a focal point in essays, because it's usually a really significant accomplishment. It makes sense that people want to write about it. However, I often find that big win, the big accomplishment, doesn't actually reveal the most interesting thing about you and your personal growth. And that probably isn't actually the moment you won. It's the something before that happened that enabled you to win. So I'll suggest to students to kind of back away from that big moment. Like, you can still include it, but instead of making that the climax of the essay, make the climax be the personal insight, just the better understanding of yourself, or like maybe even the smaller thing that you accomplished that was actually harder than like winning the thing itself. Like, how you finally got yourself back to training, or how you convinced yourself to go back to debate after you'd almost quit and you did your first small debate, and that was actually a bigger moment for you maybe than the time you won the big prize. I would just say, especially when you're looking at sort of the aha moment, the climax of the personal statement, the story you're telling, think about what moments were most significant for you, your personal development, who you are, understanding yourself, rather than the moments that you think will most impress someone else or that maybe look most important on paper. The application readers can see those big accomplishments. Like if you won some huge competition, it'll be there. So they're going to be more interested in knowing kind of like what was going on with you in those moments around that big one, because that's going to tell them more about you as a person. And now we've gotten to my last tip, tip number 8, experiment with form. I just told you to use a storytelling arc, and now I'm going to tell you you don't have to use one. I'm sort of joking and sort of not. I do think that a storytelling arc of some kind is really effective, and you do want to be thinking about that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like a traditional story that kind of goes like this. You can always just do something completely unique where you have basically like narrative breaks where you jump to different things. So there's all different things that this could look like, but for example, you could tell two different stories simultaneously and just alternate paragraphs. So one paragraph tells part of one story, the second paragraph is telling like a different story at the same time, and then at the end they somehow tie together. You can also do something where you write about like a collection of anecdotes around a theme that don't necessarily build on each other, but instead show different facets of who you are. So say you write 4 different chunks that focus on 4 different things. They don't tell a story, but they each represent something different about you. And then at the end, you kind of tie that together in some way. So let me try to explain a little bit more about what this might look like. Once I was working with a student who did this sort of 2 different stories type of essay. So in one of the stories, she was basically talking about like her day-to-day life gardening because she really liked gardening. And then in the other parallel story, she was talking about overcoming her fears in a certain sport that she did. And she kind of used the gardening essay or the gardening part of the essay to symbolically talk about some things that were going on in the sports essay. In another example of this, I was working with a student who was very involved in a specific extracurricular, and she felt very connected to people in that extracurricular in different ways. So she ended up framing the essay around 3 different stories of kind of interactions with 3 different people that showed different sides of her experience with this extracurricular, and then how that all came together into why this was so important to her world in the final paragraph. That's just an example of how you can use a structure for an essay that isn't a traditional narrative arc. So those are my 8 tips for the personal statement for today. If you would like more personalized help, like someone to look at your college essay drafts or help you develop your essays, I do offer various college essay services. You can contact me by email or through my website, and you'll find both in the description below. As always, please feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and I will do my best to answer. If you found this video helpful, please hit like and subscribe for future videos on college essays and the college admissions process.